Tonight is Ken Johnson's second ever NHL game, and after his pretty good debut, honestly, I thought we would talk to someone who knows a lot more about prospects than I do. So we've got Tony Ferrari here on today's show to talk about Ken Johnson's debut, what we liked, what we didn't like, and who we think his future line mates should be. That is all coming up on today's Locked On Blue Jackets.
Locked On Blue Jackets, your daily podcast on the Columbus Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Blue Jackets. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am, as always, your host, Jay Foster. Thank you for making this your first watch or your first listen of the day or the weekend. Locked On Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms and also on YouTube. So if you are not subscribed over there, make sure you head over to YouTube and hit the subscribe button basically as soon as possible, because that's really great for me and also for you, because then you get the episodes directly notified on your phone, because that's how technology works. In today's episode, I've got Tony Ferrari here, draft expert, prospect expert, to talk about Ken Johnson's debut. Like I said at the top of the show, things we liked, things we're excited to see more of, things that he needs to work on. Was this too soon to bring him to the NHL? And also, we talk a little bit about Cole Sillinger, because I'm capable of talking to a prospect guy without bringing up Cole Sillinger. So that's all coming up on today's episode, and I'll just get right into it. So with Ken Johnson making his NHL debut on Wednesday night, he didn't necessarily do a lot on the score sheet, but I think he probably did a lot more on the ice than certainly I expected. And I thought, who better to come and talk about our newest prospect than everybody's favorite prospect guy. So I've got Tony Ferrari here, who we've done a couple of draft profiles with earlier in the season, but now we're going to talk about Ken Johnson, because I feel like there's a lot to say about Ken Johnson.
Yeah, he's certainly a fun player. He's one of those guys that you watch, and the way I've described him oftentimes throughout the last couple of years is he's when you're 12 years old and you played the NHL video game and you were trying every deke you could possibly think of and you were dangling guys and it looked fantastic because it was a video game. That's Ken Johnson in a nutshell. He does all these video game moves. He likes to dip and dive and kind of cut through traffic and do all these goofy little things, and sometimes they don't lead to much, but when they do lead to something, it's oftentimes highlight reel stuff. So he's a guy that I think the upside's extremely high on, but I think he just needs to kind of pick and choose when he's doing the kind of fancy stuff a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. I was talking to a different prospect guy, and he said that Kent Johnson is the kind of player that thinks he's the main character in everyone else's life, which is extremely funny, and also, yeah, that tracks. Like from having seen him play like in the World Juniors and the Olympics, and as much of the Michigan games that I could see, because they're not super easy to watch over here, but he plays like the line is built around him, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But how did you think his debut went?
I think it was up and down. I think it's pretty much exactly how I expected his debut to go, to be completely honest. He had a few really nice moves. He had some really nice moments. I think his first shift, he threw a hit, which I wasn't really expecting. And then there was a couple moments on the power play where he'd be carrying the puck through the neutral zone and he'd do a weird little cut. He'd go into a 10-2 skating stride, and then he'd make a really nice pass. So you're seeing all these building blocks for what he's going to be probably next year or the year after. But he's still very raw. He's still very much going, okay, I'm 170 pounds politely, generously, and I am playing against guys that are 215. They're listed at 210, but they're actually 225 in season because they've been eating and drinking and working out all year. And this guy's going to have to adjust to that. The strength level is, I think, a pretty decent issue, but his skill outdoes that in so many areas of the ice, especially when he's out in the open ice. That's where he's a really big difference maker, and that's kind of where we saw him be a difference maker a little bit here. He didn't play much in the game, if I'm not mistaken. I think he played about 10, 12 minutes in total. So it wasn't like he got a ton of room to kind of shine, but he did show little flashes of what we're going to see soon.
Yeah, and he got a little bit of second unit power play time, which was good. And I think, like you said, that's where he really kind of was the most noticeable. And then there was another moment which I really liked. He made like a breakout pass to Bjorkstrand, who then got
Yeah.
that really great 2-on-1. That was kind of the moment where I was like, oh, that's what we're gonna get from Kent Johnson when he's, more than 170 pounds soaking wet.
Yeah.
Um, and when we talked a little bit on Twitter about this, and I said, is he ready to make the NHL? And you said, no, you would leave him in Michigan, be super patient. And I was thinking about that, and then I kind of thought about like the benefit of getting a couple of NHL games in now, so that the team can look at him and basically say, okay, do this, this, and this over the summer, come into training camp ready. And they feel like two very kind of contradictory thoughts. So do you still kind of think do you think he would have benefited from another year in Michigan? Or do you kind of think that, okay, there wasn't a ton more development he could do there, so he might as well get into the organization so they can kind of get their hands on him, so to speak?
Yeah, honestly, if I'm being completely transparent, I do think he probably could have used one more year at Michigan. He had a really good year this year, 37 points in 32 games, so it's nothing to be shy about. Certainly, he's still got a ton of potential, and he's got all these raw tools that we saw the little flashes of. But I do think he needs to learn when to pick his spots a little bit better for some of the fancy plays, some of the stuff where he does try to cut 10 to 2, or he tries to kind of dangle two guys at once or goes in alone. And we didn't see much of the going in alone. And I think one thing that you mentioned earlier is he likes to be the main character, and we didn't see much of that main character syndrome in the game he played the other day with Columbus. So that's a good thing. But at the same time, you want him to be the main character because of his skill set. So you want him to be ready to be the main character. And I just don't think he's quite ready to be that guy yet. With that said, I think, like you said, getting the games in now, letting Columbus see. I think John Davison before the game even said, yeah, like the one thing he's going to come into at the end of the year is go, wow, I really need to get stronger. And I think that's good. That's just the truth with Kent Johnson's game. Physical strength is going to be the biggest stepping stone for him. And like you said, getting that look now, going into next year, and then being able to build on that. And I think we're going to see some ups and downs in his rookie season next year. But that's why I would have said, do what you did this year, where you pull him out of college as soon as the season ends and give him the few games 1 year from now. And that's kind of where I would have approached it. But I certainly don't think it's going to hurt his development at all. Like you said, if anything, it maybe accelerates it a little bit. But there is going to be a few more growing pains, I think, in that rookie year than maybe we would have seen in an additional year's time.
Yeah, I wonder if it's kind of the same thing as, because we kind of saw it a little bit this year with Cole Sillinger, who we're going to talk about in a minute, because I will talk about Cole Sillinger forever. But I was really shocked when he made the team.
Yeah.
I think everyone was really surprised. They were expecting him to go back to Medicine Hat or go to the AHL potentially, because there was that weird loophole because he played his last year in the USHL. But I do wonder if having him make the team now has allowed the Blue Jackets to basically just kickstart his development. And I think the Blue Jackets have done a pretty good job this
Yeah.
season with player development. Guys like him and Igor Chunikov as well, I feel like has improved a ton over this season. Obviously, he's injured at the minute, so he wasn't playing in the Wednesday game. But I wonder if that's the kind of thinking that, well, we can do more good if he's on the team. And then maybe next year he spends a bunch of time in Cleveland,
Yeah.
which wouldn't surprise me. And then maybe he has this monster summer and puts on 10 pounds of muscle and comes to, it seems extremely unlikely because the kid's a string bean, but it'll be interesting to see how he looks in these kind of the 8 games left, I think they have, versus training camp, because of
Yeah.
this summer of specific Blue Jackets development. And I don't think the University of Michigan development is necessarily bad, but I
Yeah.
think the player development department in Columbus, I think, is probably quietly one of the better ones in the league. And I don't know if that's bias, but I see good things coming out of the prospect department in Columbus. In a minute, we're going to talk to Tony some more about Kent Johnson and about what kind of line mates we think would be fun for him. First, I want to tell you about BetOnline, because BetOnline is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports information. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. They've got, like I said, they've got basketball, they've got baseball, they've got football preseason stuff, they've got hockey, they've got boxing, UFC, your favorite Vegas casino games. If you want to put some money on tonight's game against the Kings, honestly, I would take the over. That would be my bet for tonight's game. Then you can do that at betonline.net. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action because BetOnline is where the game starts.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point there about Cleveland too. I think that's the other key wrinkle to this transaction of him coming to the NHL right now is next year if you deem him not ready in training camp, if you give him say 10 games at the start of the year and you go, you know what, he's not quite comfortable. You know what, go spend a little bit of time in the AHL, get comfortable, and come back up. And we saw that with Cole Caulfield this year. And now there are some mitigating circumstances. I think Dominic Ducharme was a dumpster fire of a coach there, and there was
He
a
should
lot of
be in
things
jail for what he did to Cole
there.
Caulfield's rookie
Oh my
season.
god, there was so much wrong there, and I feel like we saw that on their Stanley Cup final run the year before too. Like they were just like this fraudulent team the whole time that was winning in spite of their coaching. And then
Mhm.
we saw it obviously at the start of this year, and it was pretty unfortunate. But that same wrinkle kind of applies to Kent Johnson in terms of he has that ability to go now down to Cleveland if he needs to this year. Next year, and he'll be able to kind of take a few games down there if he needs to build some confidence if that's an issue, or just use that as an experience to gain some of that strength. And I think one of the underrated things about the AHL that people don't talk about is because the AHL is kind of the league where either you have really high end developmental players, or you have these 10-year veterans that haven't quite either made the NHL or they had a cup of coffee in the NHL, but they're just trying to keep their pro careers alive. And they're these big physical brooding guys. You end up with guys like Kyle Clifford and dudes like that down there who are more physical presences than actual skill players. So playing in the AHL, I've heard from multiple players that are currently in the NHL that that's actually a more physical league. That's the league where you learn to deal with the physicality. That's the league where you learn to get bullied a little bit here and there by these guys that at the end of the day, they're just trying to keep their careers alive. So they're going to do whatever they have to do it. So that's good. That could be a really good experience for a guy like Kent Johnson, who could go down there and understand, okay, like if I can deal with this level of physicality where they're just targeting me because I'm able to do things that they're completely not capable of doing, when I get to the NHL, there's only one line of that on a team, maybe not two or three like the AHL. So do I have more space? Do I have the ability to kind of play a more skilled game? We've seen that with multiple players over the years where they go to the AHL as 20 year olds, 21 year olds, and their numbers are fine. They're almost a point a game or they're just under a point a game. And then they get to the NHL and you're like, oh, like we expected you to be a 40-point guy and you're a 65, 70-point guy because all of those things that you dealt with, you're no longer having to deal with, and you're more used to that stuff. So I think that's a really good point of him being able to go to Cleveland because it'd be a really good setup for him too.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the AHL kind of being a tougher league to play in. I
Yeah.
think because you always think, oh, guys that are good in the NHL should be dominating in the AHL, and it's just not always the case. I mean, like specifically with the Blue Jackets, we saw, and this is not quite the same thing, obviously, but JF Berube has struggled in Cleveland this year, and then he had that like 4-game call up
Yeah.
for Columbus, and he had like a 936 per save percentage. He beat Washington and he beat another Florida as well. He beat the Florida
Yeah.
Panthers, and I was like, "Who is this?
And
Like,
and
who is
with
this
goal,
Jay Baruba?" You know? And then he went
yeah.
back to the AHL and he struggled. So I think it's
And with goalies, it's even more interesting because I think with goalies, so much of it relies on that team in front of them playing a good defensive structure. And in the AHL, like I said, you have guys either trying to save their careers in their early 30s, or you have these young players who are trying to figure out how to play pro games. So your defensive structure down there isn't quite as good. So oftentimes guys get filled in the AHL coming to the NHL, and you're like, oh, okay. Like I think Toronto's seeing that right now with a guy like Shalgren, who down in the AHL, his numbers were perfectly fine. So when he got NHL starts, everyone was like, oh, like, is this going to be awful? And he's kind of saved little parts of their season so far this year. So it's been really nice to see. And I think that's kind of that situation with goalies. And like you said, the AHL is a weird league. It's tougher. It's got some skill guys. There's certainly not bad players down there by any means, but you do have two or three lines that kind of resemble a fourth line that would be in the NHL. So you have more physical guys down there. And sometimes those guys are able to rack up points because of their physicality and everything, but it is a different game than the NHL. And I think that plays into goalies, that plays into forwards, especially a player like Ken Johnson, who his biggest weakness right now is just the physical strength that he doesn't have.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good stepping stone, I think, between obviously he's kind of been able to have his way with the puck basically nonstop in
Yeah,
Michigan. He can kind of do everything. And then you could kind of see a little bit in the game last night, or not last night, like Wednesday night, um, that he was trying these things, and you could tell that they would probably work in the NCAA, and they weren't working because he was doing
yeah,
them against like Jake Evans, for example.
yeah,
Um, and it's super interesting to think about kind of okay, so he's learned all the skill in the NCAA. Now he's going to go to the AHL potentially to learn how to not get murdered by
exactly.
people, and then he's going to turn up in the NHL, hopefully having put those two things together. Um, Also, speaking of strength, he's talked quite a bit about how he obviously he was drafted as a center. He played wing basically his entire college career on that just ridiculous line with Brisson and Matty Beniers. Do you think he can make it in the NHL as a center, or do you think he is a winger that can probably win a few faceoffs if needed?
Never say never, but William Nylander was drafted as a center as well. Mitch Marner was drafted as a center as well. Lucas Raymond was envisioned as a center at one point. You look around the league, and there's so many players drafted as centers that at the end of the day just aren't centers. And I think Ken Johnson kind of fits that profile. I think his game can really excel on the wing. I think that's where he can really kind of become the player that we all want him to be. Because, like I said, if you can get a guy that is a video game on the ice in the NHL on a consistent basis, that's just fun hockey. And I want that. I want to see that. And I think being a center kind of eliminates some of that from his game. I think being a center doesn't allow him to play to his strengths. And at the end of the day, I think he just excels a little bit more off the wing. So I think he is kind of going to be a winger in the long term. Do I see them kind of trying him at center? Of course, it makes sense to try him at center. You don't throw a guy, or you don't draft a guy as a center, especially that high in the draft, and not at least look at him in that spot. So whether it's possibly a training camp situation where they try him out in the preseason and go, maybe not, or they give him a small run in the NHL and then move him to the wing. I think there's options. He'll get tried there probably, but I do think he's a winger long term, and that kind of opens up a few options on the roster with who he could play with.
Yeah, for sure. Which is going to lead really nicely into my next question. But I think it's probably the thing about Columbus is that we have like one and a half centers on a good day.
Yeah,
So I don't think it hurts to maybe give him a shot at center and see, whether that's what he can do. But like at the minute, our number one center is Jack Roslovic. Like our number one center for most of the season was Boone Jenner, who is a winger. So Columbus is in need of some centers, but and this is to go into kind of who he could play with. I have been excited thinking about him and Cole Sillinger on the same line for basically since they were both drafted, and I got to watch them play a little bit. And obviously, that's what you talked about that a little bit on Twitter, and then you add an elite transition guy like Oliver Bjorkstrand in. Is that the best possible line that the Blue Jackets could put together? Do you think, or is there anyone else on the roster that you think Ken Johnson could have some success with?
I think that's the line I want to see, because I think that's the line I think you could envision being the top line for 5-6 years. I think that could be a line that is a real difference maker in something that intimidates other teams. And I think that's something Columbus has lacked in the last few years is especially since Panarin left, you don't really have that guy that when you step on the ice with them, you go, oh shit, we have to deal with so and so. Like we have to deal with Austin Matthews or Connor McDavid, and those guys are obviously unicorns, but you look at teams like Detroit and you go, oh, we have to deal with Lucas Raymond and we have to deal with Dylan Larkin, and you look at other teams across the league, Calgary, Johnny Gaudreau, Elias Lindholm, Matthew Tkachuk. Even in Ottawa, Brady Tkachuk doesn't score 70 points a year, but he's a piece of crap to deal with. And the Blue Jackets have some guys like that. I think Boone Jenner is an underrated guy like that. I think there are some players that you look at and you go, oh, it's going to be a long night, but you don't look at it and you go, they're going to blow the game up and we don't have a chance. And I think that's what Ken Johnson and Cole Sillinger could be together. I think that line would be ridiculous. And like you said, I mentioned pairing a high-end transition guy. Bjorkstrand would be really fun. I think I was talking to someone else and they were talking about Voracek on that line as the wily old vet, make him grow the beard out and go Joe Thornton on them. And I think that would be really fun too, because I think he'd bring that really methodical element to that line. And I think that he's still got some underrated game breaking ability at times, and it's still there once in a while. And he's still passing the puck with the best of them. He's still an excellent playmaker. His goal scoring has fallen off a little bit this year, but I think you put him on a line with those two and he gets some sneaky goals, especially around the net, doing what he does and kind of coming in off the wing or hiding in the shadows. There's a lot that Voracek could bring to that line too. So there's options for that other wing, but I think the real drivers of that line are going to be Kent Johnson and Cole Sillinger if they get to play together.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk about Cole Sillinger for a little bit, actually, because he has kind of been he's kind of flown under the radar this season, I think, as a rookie because of, Trevor Zegras is out here, like, dangling guys out of their jock straps, and Moritz Seider is probably one of the best young defensemen that the Red Wings have seen in a very, very long time. And then there's, 85-year-old Michael Bunting getting called a consideration. And so Cole Sillinger never really has kind of had a chance to get in that conversation. But considering, he's got 13 goals this season on an aggressively mediocre Blue Jackets team, let's say, and he's not even 19 yet. He's 19 next month, I think. How impressive has his season been? Is this what you expected from him, or is this kind of a surprise?
Cole Sillinger was one of those guys where people were like, if there's a sneaky guy in the draft, who's going to kind of sneak onto an NHL roster, depending on where they get drafted. And I feel like a lot of people went with Cole Sillinger because he was physically developed. He's a guy that, what he's kind of going to be in the NHL, or at least people thought they knew what he was going to be in the NHL. And I felt like he could be a great complementary player. He could be a great passenger on a line if he got into the NHL. And he stepped into the NHL, and I was like, oh, so he's going to do it. He's going to do what we all expected. It was not unexpected, but he's going to do what kind of we all had in the back of our minds as a possibility. And I think he's exceeded expectations in that regard because he's not necessarily the passenger on that line. I think he does a lot to drive that line himself. And we're seeing that kind of play driving ability starting to bubble up to the surface with him. Like you mentioned, he has 13 goals on the season, 26 points. It's a pretty solid rookie season for an 18-year-old who stepped into the NHL literally after a weird COVID season where it forced him to go down to the United States to play for a little bit. And then of course he played junior hockey in Medicine Hat as a 16-year-old. So it's like, he's been all over. He's kind of not ever really found a stable ground. So for an 18-year-old to be able to get into the NHL and look like he has, a responsible player, I think his defensive game has kind of grown this year. He's showing some really nice tendencies as a center. I think long term, I look at Cole Sillinger and I'm like, that could be the number one center for the Blue Jackets. He's the kind of guy that I look at and I go, this is a guy that's exceeded expectations year one out of the draft. What is he going to do in year 3 or 4 when he's even more physically developed? He's got even more power on his shot. He's a real difference maker as a goal scorer. How much does his playmaking improve on top of what it's already done this year? And then, like we said, I mentioned that it'd be nice to have a high-end transition player like Bjorkstrand on a line with him and Kent Johnson, but is Cole Sillinger going to develop that? Because we've seen flashes of it this year. So there's a lot to like with Cole Sillinger. I think he's exceeded what everyone kind of thought of him. And going into last year's draft season, when at the start of the year, Cole Sillinger was a guy that a lot of people kind of had sneaky a top 5 guy, and he kind of fell down the boards. And I think that was just because no one really impressed last year because it was such a weird year. So Cole Sillinger going where he did to Columbus was a great pick. Obviously pairing him with Kent Johnson in the draft in their prospect pool. And now he's coming in, making a difference already at 18. It's just been a really impressive season, in my opinion.
Yeah, the Blue Jackets, I think, have done very well in this draft. And I think when you, like, even looking back on it now, you look at kind of who was drafted between Johnson and Sillinger, and you're like, how did Sillinger fall to 12th? Like, I'm thrilled that he did, but like, you look at, for example, the Senators drafted
Tyler Boucher,
son of noted Ottawa Senators employee Guy Boucher, but and you just look at that and you're like, man, we really lucked out with Cole Sillinger, and I'm super, super excited for, like, maybe not next season, this Blue Jackets squad, but the season after that, I think is going to be really a lot of fun.
Yeah, they've got a really sneaky good prospect pool. I still think there's going to be pieces to add this year and next year in the draft. I think they're still going to need a couple more pieces, but yeah, with Kent Johnson and Cole Sillinger coming out of last year's draft, I think, like you said, you look at the guys that went ahead of them. Tyler Boucher obviously is what he is. I don't think you can't really say anything about it. It's not, he hasn't had a good draft plus one. The Senators messed up a little bit there, but you're looking at guys like William Eklund. He went back to Sweden this year. Is that going to be a guy that you look at Cole Sillinger and you go, is he better than? And I don't know. There's a long way to go, but there's a lot of value that was drafted in that top 12 that you're seeing Cole Sillinger at least look comparable to.
Yeah, exactly. I will not tell the Locked On Sharks guys that you you
Oh,
said that
they
Sillinger might be better than Eklund because they might find your
no,
house. But
they love me. They're fine. They know I love William Eklund, and that's just it. Like that group from 6 to 12 with where Sillinger ended up. Outside of Tyler Boucher, I, again, I don't want to dump on the kid, but it wasn't a great pick. But that whole 6 to 12 range, I think there's a lot of players in there that you're like, which one of these guys is going to turn out to be the star of this group? Because there's a lot of talent in that group that, because of such a weird year with COVID and the pandemic and everything and interruptions in the seasons last year, which one of them is going to be the guy that was affected by that we should have seen go in the top five?
yeah, exactly. I do want to finish off. Obviously, talking about this year's draft, we've touched on a couple of prospects. I believe we talked about Shane Wright and Brad Lambert earlier in the season. Blue Jackets have got a couple of picks. Who is there anyone that you think would fit in particularly well on this Blue Jackets roster that is probably going to pick in? It's probably going to go between maybe say 5th and 15th.
There's a lot of fun players in this draft, and I think the thing with this draft is after 1 and 2, pretty much, maybe even 3, with Juracek kind of filling in that third spot. There's a lot of variety in who people think are going to go where, whether it's a Matthew Savoy or a Frank Nazar, a Joakim Kamel. I know a lot of people were really high on him at the start of the season. Have kind of cooled down a little bit, but there's a lot of talent. I look at a guy like Gleb Trikazov, who's a Russian kid who's got all this crazy, insane talent. We've seen Columbus go off the board from time to time, and the pick ended up looking pretty decent afterwards. So maybe he's a guy that people look at, because there's a few public boards with him in the top 15, including my own. So it's going to be really interesting. But a guy that I really like for them in that range, if they could land him, is a guy like Yuri Slafkovsky, big hulking winger. Again, you'd like a center, but a lot of the centers after those top 2 guys are much in the same boat as Kent Johnson. Are they going to be a center? Or are they going to be a winger at the next level? So you get a guy like Slafkovsky, who's this huge frame, got a ton of power to his game, plays that real power forward game that Columbus seems to love. And this is going to, I'm not even going to say, oh, well, whatever. Rick Nash was a guy that Columbus loved for years because of the power and the speed and the skill that he blended in his game. And while I don't think Yuri Slafkovsky is going to be quite Rick Nash, because Rick Nash is a legend, but Slafkovsky brings some of those same elements to his game. So if he can play on the wing and do some of the stuff that Rick Nash used to do in Columbus, I think he could easily be a fan favorite there as well, and be a guy that would add to this roster and give them an element that I think Columbus seems to love on their teams over the years. And you can never have too much of it, especially when it comes with really good skill. And that's what Slafkovsky has.
Yeah, for sure. I talked to one prospect guy who was like, yeah, he skates well, and not like well for a big guy. He just skates well.
Yeah.
So that's good. But yeah, I don't necessarily agree with. There's been a lot of talk about how Columbus needs to find grit and find some size. Obviously, Boone Jenner's out injured at the minute. We lost Pierre-Luc Dubois last season, who was one of our, he's one of maybe 5 genuine power forwards in this league. Josh Anderson was a big body. Nick Foligno obviously will go toe-to-toe with anyone. And I do think that they don't necessarily need like grit and punchiness, but I do think maybe someone who is taller than 5'11"
Yeah.
might help. Although Patrick Laine is like 6'5", which I always forget until I see him next to other players. But he's also not a guy that's going to throw that size around. So
Yeah.
someone like Slafkovsky could be interesting.
Yeah, Patrick Laine is a player I love. I love Patrick Laine. He's such a fun player to watch. But he's very much the 6'3", 6'4", 6'5" player that plays like a 5'11" player who doesn't really love throwing his body around.
Yeah. So for people who want to learn more about prospects, check in with the Maple Leafs, I guess. If I I can't in good conscience encourage that. But if people want to check in on the Maple Leafs, talk about prospects or
Oh,
anything, where can they find you and your work?
well, I try to avoid talking about the Maple Leafs as much as I can, despite growing up a fan of them, because they are the Maple Leafs and it's frustrating. So I'm usually talking Wings or Sens or whoever's bad in the league, their prospect pool, because they usually have the fun prospects. But no, so you can find me on Twitter at the Tony Ferrari, and all my work's over at the Hockey News as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming to talk about Kent Johnson, Cole Sillinger, and I'm sure we'll have to have you on at some point later in the season when we know where the Blue Jackets are picking, so we can talk more prospects.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely be happy to come back on.